My name's Pete Woods. You're watching Hexhamtv. Welcome everyone who's watching from wherever you're watching from. And Hexhamtv is an online TV channel based in Northumberland. And we're running a number of different events over time. And tonight we're lucky enough to have Stephen Tomlin with us. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Pete. Welcome. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And Stephen, you're going to read us some M.R. James this evening. Tell me, why did you choose this piece?
Well, you know, this is, as you know, this is our third collaboration. I've chosen 3 stories from really what I'm calling the golden age of ghost story writing, late Victorian, early Edwardian, a time alive with all sorts of, cultural, social, political activities. And there was some brilliant writing going on. And I started with the Oscar Wilde one, the Canterville Ghost, which I think is an absolute wonderful piece of comic writing, and so polished and beautiful and wonderfully delivered and balanced and so subtle in different layers. Just a great story. It was a wonderful story to kick off with. And that was really from the 1880s, but kind of ahead of its time. And then we got to H.G. Wells, and what an extraordinary sort of polymath he was. So there was a guy, bridging arts and science, and just looking at this ground between magic and superstition and kind of threat and sort of something sort of more sinister in the dark and light, and the relationship between the father and his son going to a magic toy shop and all the crazy things that happened to them there, and trying to make sense of that. So that was kind of like a bit more experimental, a bit more of a cutting edge Edwardian story, 1903. And then we get to this one, by somebody really who's a sort of a godfather of ghastliness, really, in the English style, and that's M.R. James. And he was an extraordinary man. He was a great intellectual, an academic, and spent all his life in academia, really. Ended up as provost of King's College, Cambridge, and then after that, as provost of Eton as well, his own school. So he really was a man of the establishment, but with a great imagination, and really tapped into a psyche, which a certain kind of helter-skelter, kind of slightly off-the-wall Englishness, a sort of gentle, ghostly presence that he would bring up, and sort of delving below the sort of consciousness and writing stories, which, in a way, I suppose he updated the form. They weren't taken away from the sort of Gothic settings that so many of them were in the 19th century, and put it into a modern context. So this story, for example, it is in a library, but it's also, trains feature as well. So that makes it even more British as well, of course, and an added dimension. And they're disturbing stories. And I've kind of a quote here, and if I sort of perhaps quote this, it might just explain more articulately than I can, because it's from the man's own mouth. And he says here, if any of my stories succeed in causing their readers to feel pleasantly uncomfortable when walking along a solitary road at nightfall, or sitting over a dying fire in the small hours, my purpose in writing them will have been attained. So, well, there you are, the man says it for himself. The presence, though, within this, there is a dark presence, and it kind of builds to it. And what I also like about this story is that in some ways, it's got all the ingredients of a Sherlock Holmes story. And I'd like to see Conan Doyle take his recipe and take all these ingredients and then make something of it with Sherlock Holmes. Because that all those threads are there. And when I read it, I think you'll see what I mean. It was also interesting to learn that M.R. James was also a big fan of Agatha Christie. Say no more. So again, I think the story, in a way, is a bit of a homage to Agatha's style, the Queen of Crime. So we'll see. Ghost story meets detective story. So there we are, 3 different stories that we've given voice to, and you provided the platform for, which I hope have been enjoyable for people to listen to. That's it. This is the trilogy complete.
Stephen, over to you for the reading.
Okay. Thank you very much. A glass of water. Right. The Tractate Middoth by M.R. James. Towards the end of an autumn afternoon, an elderly man with a thin face and grey Piccadilly weepers pushed open the swing door leading into the vestibule of a certain famous library and inquired if he might take a book out. He produced his card, Mr. John Eldred, and, the register being consulted, a favourable answer was given. "It is a long time since I was here, and I do not know my way about your building. Besides, it's in near closing time, and it is bad for me to hurry up and downstairs. I have here the title of the book I want. Is there anyone at liberty who could go and find it for me?" After a moment's thought, the doorkeeper beckoned to a young man who was passing. "Mr. Garrett," he said, "have you a minute to assist this gentleman?" "Ah, with pleasure," was Mr. Garrett's reply. The slip with the title was handed to him. "I think I can put my hand on this. It happens to be in the class I inspected last quarter, but I'll just look it up in the catalogue to make sure. I suppose it is that particular edition that you require, sir?" "Yes, if you please. That and no other," said Mr. Eldred. "I am exceedingly obliged to you." "Oh, don't mention it, I beg, sir," said Mr. Garrett, and hurried off. "I thought so," Garrett said to himself, when his finger, travelling down the pages of the catalogue, stopped at a particular entry. Talmud, Tractate Middoth, with a commentary of Nachmanides, Amsterdam, 1707, 11.3.34. Hebrew class, of course. Not a very difficult job, this. Mr. Eldred, accommodated with a chair in the vestibule, awaited anxiously the return of his messenger, and his disappointment at seeing an empty-handed Mr. Garrett running down the staircase was very evident. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, sir," said the young man, "but the book is out." "Oh dear," said Mr. Eldred. "Is that so? You are sure there can be no mistake?" "I don't think there's much chance of it, sir. But it's possible, if you'd like to wait a minute, that you might meet the very gentleman that's got it. He must be leaving the library soon, and I think I saw him take that particular book off the shelf." "Oh, indeed. You didn't recognize him, did you?" I should have known him, but the light isn't very good in that part of the library at this time of day, and I didn't see his face. He was a shortish old gentleman, perhaps a clergyman in a cloak. If you could wait, I can easily find out whether he wants the book very particularly." No, said Mr. Eldred. "I can't wait now, thank you. No, I must be off. But I'll call again tomorrow if I may, and perhaps you could find out who has it." "Oh, certainly, sir. I'll have the book ready for you." But Mr. Eldred was already off, and hurrying more than one would have thought wholesome for him. It was vexatious to Garrett's self-respect to have disappointed an inquirer with so little reason, and would have liked, had it not been against library rules, to take the book down to the vestibule then and there, so that it might be ready for Mr. Eldred when he called. However, next morning he was himself in the vestibule when Mr. Eldred arrived, very soon after the library opened, and when hardly anyone beside the staff were in the building. "I'm very sorry," he said. "It's not often that I make such a stupid mistake, but I did feel sure that the old gentleman I saw took out that very book and kept it in his hand without opening it, just as people do, you know, sir, when they mean to take a book out of the library and not merely refer to it. But, however, I'll run up now at once and get it for you this time." And here intervened a pause. Mr. Eldred paced the entry, read all the notices, consulted his watch, sat and gazed up the staircase, did all that a very impatient man could, until some 20 minutes had run out. At last he addressed himself to the doorkeeper and inquired if it were a very long way to that part of the library to which Mr. Garrett had gone. "Well, I was thinking it was funny, sir. He's a quick man as a rule, but to be sure he might have been sent for by the librarian. But even so, I'd think he'd have mentioned to him that you was waiting. I'll just speak to him on the tube and see. And to the tube he addressed himself. As he absorbed the replies to his questions, his face changed. Then he came forward to his counter and spoke in a lower tone. I'm sorry to hear, sir. Something seems to have happened, a little awkward. Mr. Garrett's been took poorly, it appears, and the librarian sent him home in a cab the other way. Something of an attack, by what I can hear. What, really? Do you mean that someone has injured him? No, sir, no violence here, but attacked with illness. But as to your book, sir, perhaps you might be able to find it for yourself. It's too bad you should be disappointed this way twice over. But I'm so sorry that Mr. Garrett should have been taken ill in this way while he was obliging me. I think I must leave the book and call and inquire after him. Well, you can give me his address, I suppose. That was easily done. Mr. Garrett, it appeared, lodged in rooms not far from the station. And one other question. Do you happen to notice if an old gentleman, perhaps a clergyman, in a black cloak, left the library after I did yesterday? You see, I think I may have known him. Well, not in a black cloak, sir, no. There was only two gentlemen left later than what you done, sir. There was Mr. Carter, took out a music book, and one of the professors, a couple of novels. That's a lot, sir. And then I went off to me tea, and glad to get it. Oh, thank you, sir. Much obliged. Mr. Eldred, still a prey to anxiety, betook himself in a cab to Mr. Garrett's address. But the young man was not yet in a condition to receive visitors. He was better, but his landlady considered that he must have had a severe shock. Eldred returned the next day and was admitted. When in health, Mr. Garrett was a cheerful and pleasant-looking young man. Now he was a very white and shaky being, propped up in an armchair by the fire, and inclined to shiver and keep an eye on the door. It is really I who owe you an apology, Mr. Eldred, and I was despairing of being able to pay it, for I didn't know your address. But I am very glad that you have called. I do dislike and regret giving all this trouble. But you know I could not have foreseen this attack which I had. Of course not. But now, was it a fall you had? No, I did fall on the floor, but not from any height. It was really a shock. You mean something startled you? Was it anything you thought you saw? Yes, it was something I saw. You remember when you called the first time at the library? Yes, of course. Well, now, let me beg you, try not to describe it. It will not be good for you to recall it, I'm sure. But indeed, it would be a relief to me to tell anyone like yourself. You might be able to explain it away. It was just when I was going into the class where your book is. Indeed, Mr. Garrett, I insist. Besides, my watch tells me I have but very little time left to get my things together and take the train. No, not another word. It would be more distressing to you than you imagine, perhaps. Now, there's just one thing I want to say. I feel I have been really indirectly responsible for this illness of yours, and I think I ought to defray the expense which it has. But the offer was quite clearly declined. Mr. Eldred, not pressing it, left almost at once. Not, however, before Mr. Garrett had insisted upon his taking a note of the class mark of the Tractate Middoth, which, as he said, Mr. Eldred could at leisure get for himself. But Mr. Eldred did not reappear at the library. William Garrett had another visitor that day, in the person of a contemporary and colleague from the library, one George Earle, one of those who had found Garrett insensible on the floor just inside the class, or cubicle, in which the Hebrew books were placed. Very anxious about his friend's condition, as soon as library hours were over, Earle appeared at the lodgings. "Well, I've no notion what it was that put you wrong, but I've got the idea there's something wrong in the atmosphere of the library. Well, just before we found you, I was coming along the gallery and I thought to myself, did ever you know such a musty smell everywhere as there is about here? It can't be wholesome. It must get into the system and break out sometime. Well, don't you think?" Garrett shook his head. "That's all very well about the smell, George, but it isn't always there, though I have noticed it in the last day or two. It's a sort of unnaturally strong smell of dust. Yeah. But no, that's not what did it for me. It was something I saw, and I want to tell you about it. I went into that Hebrew class to get a book for a man that was inquiring for it down below. I'd been for it, and I was sure that I saw an old parson in a cloak taking it out. I told my man it was out. Well, off he went to call again next day. I went back to see if I could get it out of the parson, but no parson there, and the book on the shelf. Well, yesterday, as I say, I went again. This time, if you please, 10 o'clock in the morning, remember, and as much light as ever you get in those classes, and there was my parson again, back to me, looking at the books on the shelves I wanted. His hat was on the table, and he had a bald head. I waited a second or two, looking at him rather particularly. I tell you, he had a very nasty, bald head. It looked to me dry, and it looked dusty, and the streaks of hair across it were much less like hair than cobwebs. Well, I made a bit of a noise on purpose, coughed and moved my feet. He turned round and let me see his face. And I hadn't seen it before, and I tell you again, I'm not mistaken. Though for one reason or another, I didn't take in the lower part of his face, but I did see the upper part. And it was perfectly dry, and the eyes were deep sunk. And over them, from the eyebrows to the cheekbone, there were cobwebs. Thick cobwebs. Now that closed me up, as they say. I can't tell you anything more. Before returning to the library to work, the librarian insisted upon his taking a week's rest and change of air. Within a few days' time, therefore, William Garrett was at the station with his bag, looking for a desirable smoking compartment in which to travel to Burnstow-on-Sea, which he had not previously visited. One compartment, and one only, seemed to be suitable. But just as he approached it, he saw, standing in front of the door, a figure so like one bound up with recent unpleasant associations that, with a sickening qualm, and hardly knowing what he did, he tore open the door of the next compartment and pulled himself into it as quickly as if death were at his heels. The train moved off, and he must have turned quite faint, but he was next conscious of a smelling bottle being put to his nose. His physician was a nice-looking old lady who, with her daughter, was the only passenger in the carriage. But for this incident, it is not very likely that he would have made any overtures to his fellow travellers. As it was, thanks and inquiries and general conversation supervened inevitably. And Garrett found himself provided, before the journey's end, not only with a physician, but with a landlady. For Mrs. Simpson had apartments to let at Burnstow, which seemed in all ways suitable. The place was empty at that season, so that Garrett was thrown a good deal into the society of mother and daughter. He found them very acceptable company. On the third evening of his stay, he was on such terms with them as to be asked to spend the evening in their private sitting room. During their talk, it transpired that Garrett's work lay in a library. Ah, libraries are fine places, said Mrs. Simpson, putting down her work with a sigh. But for all that, books have played me a sad turn, or rather, a book has. Well, books give me my living, Mrs. Simpson, and I should be sorry to say a word against them. I don't like to hear that they've been bad for you. Perhaps Mr. Garrett could help us to solve our puzzle, Mother, said Miss Simpson. I don't want to set Mr. Garrett off on a hunt that might waste a lifetime, my dear, nor yet to trouble him with our private affairs. But if you think it's in the least likely that I could be of use, I do beg you to tell me what the puzzle is, Mrs. Simpson. If it is finding out anything about a book, you see, I am in rather a good position to do it. Yes, I do see that. But the worst of it is that we don't know the name of the book, nor what it is about. No, not that either. Except that we don't think it's in English, Mother. And that's not much of a clue. Well, Mr. Garrett, said Mrs. Simpson, who had not yet resumed her work and was looking at the fire thoughtfully. I shall tell you the story. You will please keep it to yourself, if you don't mind. Thank you. Now, it is just this. I had an old uncle, a Dr. Rant. Perhaps you may have heard of him? Not that he was a distinguished man, but from the odd way he chose to be buried. I rather think I have seen the name in some guidebook. That would be it, said Miss Simpson. He left directions, horrid old man, that he was to be put, sitting at a table in his ordinary clothes, in a brick room that he had made underground in a field near his house. Of course, the country people say he's been seen about there in his old black cloak. Well, dear, I don't know much about such things, Mrs. Simpson went on. But anyhow, he is dead. He is 20 years and more. He was a clergyman, though I'm sure I can't imagine how he got to be one. But he did no duty for the last part of his life, which I think was a good thing. And he lived on his own property, a very nice estate, and not very far from here. He had no wife or family, only one niece, who was myself, and one nephew, and he had no particular liking for either of us, nor for anyone else, as far as that goes. If anything, he liked my cousin better than he did me, for John was much more like him in his temper, and, I'm afraid I must say, his very mean, sharp ways. It might have been different if I had not married, but I did, and that he very much resented. Very well. Here he was with this estate, and a good deal of money, as it turned out, of which he had the absolute disposal. And it was understood that we, my cousin and I, would share it equally at his death. In a certain winter, about 20 years back, he was taken ill, and I was sent for to nurse him. My husband was alive then, but the old man would not hear of his coming. As I drove up to the house, I saw my cousin John driving away from it in an open fly, and I noticed in very good spirits. I went up and did what I could for my uncle, but I was very soon sure that this would be his last illness, and he was convinced of it too. During the day before he died, he got me to sit by him all the time, and I could see there was something, and probably something unpleasant, that he was saving up to tell me, and putting it off as long as he felt he could afford the strength. I'm afraid purposely, in order to keep me on the stretch. But at last, out it came. Mary, he said, Mary, I've made my will in John's favour. He has everything, Mary. Well, of course, that came as a bitter shock, for we, my husband and I, were not rich people. But I said little or nothing to my uncle, except that he had a right to do what he pleased. partly because I couldn't think of anything to say, and partly because I was sure there was more to come. And so there was. But Mary, he said, I'm not very fond of John, and I've made another will in your favour. You can have everything, only you've got to find the will, you see. And I don't mean to tell you where it is. Then he chuckled to himself, and I waited, for again, I was sure he hadn't finished. That's a good girl, he said after a time. You see, and I'll tell you as much as I told John, but just let me remind you, you can't go into court with what I'm saying to you, or you won't be able to produce any collateral evidence beyond your own word. John's a man that can do a little hard swearing if necessary. Very well, then. That's understood. Now, I had the fancy that I wouldn't write this will in quite the common way, so I wrote it in a book. Yeah, it's a printed book, and there's several thousand books in this house. But there, you needn't trouble yourself with them, for it's not one of them. It's in safe keeping elsewhere, in a place where John can go and find it in a day, if he only knew, and you cannot. A good will it is, properly signed and witnessed, but I don't think you'll find the witnesses in a hurry. Still, I said nothing. If I had moved at all, I would have taken hold of the old wretch and shaken him. He lay there, laughing to himself, and at last he said, Well, you've taken it very quietly, and as I want to start you both on equal terms, and John has a bit of a purchase in being able to go where the book is, I'll tell you just two things which I didn't tell him. The will's in English, but you won't know that if ever you see it. That's one thing, and another is that when I'm gone, you'll find an envelope in my desk directed to you, and inside it, something that would help you to find it, if only you have the wits to use it. In a few hours from that, he was gone. And though I made an appeal to John Eldred about it, John Eldred? Well, I beg your pardon, Mrs. Simpson. I think I've seen a Mr. John Eldred. What is he like to look at? It must have been 10 years since I saw him. He'd be a thin, elderly man now, and unless he's shaved them off, he has that sort of whiskers which people used to call Dundreary or Piccadilly something. Weepers. Yes, that is the man. Where did you come across him, Mr. Garrett? I don't know if I could tell you, said Garrett mendaciously. In some public place. Please, you haven't finished. Really, I had nothing much to add. Only that John Eldred, of course, paid no attention whatever to my letters, and has enjoyed the estate ever since, while my daughter and I have had to take to the lodging-house business here, which, I must say, has not turned out by any means so unpleasant as I feared it might. But about the envelope? Oh, to be sure, yes, the puzzle turns on that. Give Mr. Garrett the paper out of my desk, Carrie, please. It was a small slip, with nothing whatever on it but 5 numerals, not divided or punctuated in any way. 1, 1, 3, 3, 4. Mr. Garrett pondered, but there was a light in his eye. Suddenly he made a face, and then asked, Do you suppose that Mr. Eldred can have any more clue than you have to the title of the book? I have sometimes thought he must, said Mrs. Simpson, and in this way, that my uncle must have made the will not very long before he died. That I think he said for himself, and got rid of the book immediately afterwards. But all his books were very carefully catalogued, and John has the catalogue. And John was most particular that no books whatever should be sold out of the house. And I'm told that he's always journeying about to booksellers and libraries. So I fancy he must have found out just which books are missing from my uncle's library of those which are entered in the catalogue, and must be hunting for them. Just so, said Mr. Garrett, and relapsed into thought. No later than next day, he received a letter, which, as he told Mrs. Simpson with great regret, made it absolutely necessary for him to cut short his stay at Burnstow. Sorry as he was to leave them, they were at least as sorry to part with him. He had begun to feel that a crisis, all important to Mrs. and shall we add Miss Simpson, was very possibly supervening. In the train, Garrett was uneasy and excited. He racked his brains to think whether the press mark of the book which Mr. Eldred had been inquiring after was one in any way corresponding to the numbers on Mrs. Simpson's little piece of paper. But he found to his dismay that the shock of the previous week had really so upset him that he could neither remember any vestige of the title or nature of the book, or even of the locality to which he had gone to seek it. And yet all other parts of the library topography and work were clear as ever in his mind. And another thing, he stamped with annoyance at the thought of it. He had at first hesitated and then forgotten to ask Mrs. Simpson for the name of the place where Eldred lived. That, however, he could write to her about. At least he had his clue in the figures on the paper. If they referred to a press mark in his library, they were only susceptible of a limited number of interpretations. They might be divided into 1.13.34, 11.33.4, or 11.3.34. He could try all these in the space of a few minutes, and if anyone were missing, he had every means of tracing it. He got very quickly to work. A few minutes had to be spent in explaining his early return to his landlady and his colleagues. 1.13.34 was in place and contained no extraneous writing. As he drew near to class 11 in the same gallery, its associations struck him like a chill. But he must go on. After a cursory glance at 11.33.4, which first confronted him and was a perfectly new book, he ran his eyes along the line of quartos which fills 11.3. The gap he feared was there. 34 was out. A moment was spent in making sure that it had not been misplaced, and then he was off to the vestibule to speak to Hodgson, the doorman. Has 11.33.34 gone out? Do you recollect noticing that number? Notice the number? What do you take me for, Mr. Garrett? There, take a look over the tickets for yourself, if you've got a free day before you. Well then, has a Mr. Eldred called again? The old gentleman. He came the day I was taken ill? Oh, come, you'd remember him. What do you suppose? Of course I recollect of him. No, he's not been in again, not since you went off on your holiday. And yet I seem to... There now, Roberts will know. Roberts, do you recollect the name of Eldred? Oh, not half, said the porter. You mean the man that sent a bob over the price for the parcel? Ah, I wish they all did. Do you mean to say that you've been sending books to Mr. Eldred, have you? Oh, no, Mr. Garrett. The gentleman sends a ticket all wrote correct, and the secretary says this book may go in the box ready addressed with the note, and a sum of money sufficient to defray the railway charges. What would your action be, eh, Mr. Garrett? Well, yes, you were perfectly right, of course. Perfectly right. Only would you oblige me by showing me the ticket Mr. Eldred sent and letting me know his address? Well, there's a ticket on the file. J. Eldred, 11.3.34, title of work, T.A.L.M. Well, there, make of it what you like. It's not a novel, I should hazard. And here is Mr. Eldred's note, applying for the book in question, which I see he terms a track. Thanks. Thanks. But the address? There's none on the note. Why, that note come inside of the parcel, which was directed very thoughtfully to save all the trouble. ready to be sent back with the book inside. And if I have made any mistake in this old transaction, it lays just in the one point that I neglected to enter the address in my little book what I keep here, in my lodge office. Yes, well, admirable arrangement, to be sure, Mr. Roberts, but all right. Thank you. Oh, yes, when did the parcel go off? 10:30 this morning. Oh, good. And it's just 1 now. Garrett went upstairs in deep thought. How was he to get the address? Mrs. Simpson had said that Eldred lived on his uncle's estate. Now, if this was so, he might find that place entered in the donation book. That he could run through quickly, now that he knew the title of the book. The register was soon before him, and knowing that the old man had died more than 20 years ago, he gave him a good margin and turned back to 1870. There was but one entry possible. 1875, August 14th, the Tractate Middoth, Amsterdam, 1707. Donor J.J. Rand of Bretfield Manor. A gazetteer showed Bretfield to be 3 miles from a small station on the main line. So far, well. Next, a timetable. A train could be got in 20 minutes, taking 2 hours over the journey. The only chance, but one not to be missed, and the train was taken. If he had been fidgety on the journey up, he was almost distracted on the journey down. If he found Eldred, what could he say? That it had been discovered that the book was a rarity and must be recalled, an obvious untruth. Or that it was believed to contain an important manuscript note. Eldred would, of course, show him the book, from which the leaf would have already been removed. He might, perhaps, find traces of the removal, a torn edge of a fly-leaf probably, and who could disprove, what Eldred was certain to say, that he too had noticed and regretted the mutilation. Altogether, the chase seemed very hopeless. The one chance was this. The book had left the library at 10:30. It might not have been put into the first possible train at 11:20. Granted that, then he might be lucky enough to arrive simultaneously with it and patch up some story which would induce Eldred to give it up. It was drawing toward evening when he got out upon the platform of his station, and, like most country stations, it seemed unnaturally quiet. He inquired of the station master whether Mr. Eldred was in the neighbourhood. Yes, pretty near too, I believe. I fancy he means calling here for a parcel he expects. I called for it once today already, and appeared to think it was all along of me that it had not come by the 2 o'clock. Anyhow, we've got it for him now. And the porter flourished a square parcel, which, a glance assured Garrett, contained all that was of any importance to him at this moment. Bretfield, sir? Yes, it's 3 miles just about. The shortcut across these 3 fields, yeah, brings it down by half a mile. Oh, there. Look, there's Mr. Eldred's trap. A dog cart drove up with 2 men in it, of whom Garrett, gazing back as he crossed the little station yard, easily recognised one. The fact that Eldred was driving was slightly in his favour, but most likely he would not open the parcel in the presence of his servant. On the other hand, he would get home quickly, and unless Garrett were there within a few minutes of his arrival, all would be over. He must hurry, and that he did. His shortcut took him along one side of a triangle, while the cart had 2 sides to traverse, and it was delayed a little at the station, so that Garrett was in the 3rd of the 3 fields when he heard the wheels fairly near. He had made the best progress possible, but the pace at which the cart was coming made him despair. At this rate, it must reach home 10 minutes before him, and 10 minutes would be more than suffice for the fulfilment of Mr. Eldred's project. It was just at this time that his luck fairly turned. The evening was still, and sounds came clearly. Seldom has any sound given greater relief than that which he now heard, that of the cart pulling up. A few words were exchanged, and it drove on. Garrett, halting in the utmost anxiety, was able to see, as it drove past, that it contained only the servant and not Eldred. Further, he made out that Eldred was following on foot. From behind the tall hedge by the stile leading into the road, he watched the thin, wiry figure pass quickly by, with a parcel beneath its arm and feeling in its pockets. Just as he passed the stile, something fell out of a pocket upon the grass, but with so little sound that Eldred was not conscious of it. In a moment more, it was safe for Garrett to cross the stile into the road and pick up a box of matches. Eldred went on, and, as he went, his arms made hasty movements, difficult to interpret in the shadow of the trees that overhung the road. But, as Garrett followed cautiously, he found, at various points, the key to them, a piece of string, and then the wrapper of the parcel. Now Eldred was walking slower, and it could just be made out that he had opened the book and was turning over the leaves. He stopped, evidently troubled by the failing light. Garrett slipped into a gate opening, but still watched. Eldred, hastily looking round, sat down on a felled tree trunk by the roadside and held the open book up close to his eyes. Suddenly he laid it, still open, on his knee, and felt in all his pockets, clearly in vain, and clearly to his annoyance. "You would be glad of your matches now," thought Garrett. Then Eldred took hold of a leaf and was carefully tearing it out when two things happened. First, something black seemed to drop upon the white leaf and run down it, and then, as Eldred started and was turning to look behind him, a little dark form appeared to rise out of the shadows behind the tree trunk, and, from its two arms enclosing a mass of blackness, came before Eldred's face and covered his head and neck. His legs and arms were wildly flourished, but no sound came. Then there was no more movement. Eldred was alone. He had fallen back into the grass behind the tree trunk. The book was cast into the roadway. Garrett, his anger and suspicion gone for the moment at the sight of this horrid struggle, rose up with loud cries of "Help!" And so, too, to his enormous relief, did a labourer who had just emerged from a field opposite. Together they bent over and supported Eldred, but to no purpose. The conclusion that he was dead was inevitable. "Poor gentleman," said Garrett to the labourer, when they had laid him down. "What happened to him, do you think?" "I wasn't 200 yards away," said the man, "when I see Squire Eldred sitting reading of his book, and to my thinking, he was took with one of them fits. Face seemed to go over all black." "Just so," said Garrett. "You didn't see anyone near him? It couldn't have been an assault?" "Not possible. No one could have gotten away without you and me seeing them." "So I thought. Well, we must get some help, and the doctor and the policeman, and perhaps I'd better give them this book." It was obviously a case for an inquest, and obvious also that Garrett must stay at Bretfield and give his evidence. The medical inspection showed that, though some blast was found on the face and in the mouth of the deceased, the cause of death was a shock to a weak heart and not asphyxiation. The fateful book was produced, a respectable quarto printed wholly in Hebrew, quite unremarkable. The coroner addressed Garrett. "You say that the deceased gentleman appeared at the moment before his attack to be tearing a leaf out of this book?" "Yes, I think one of the fly leaves." "There's here a fly leaf partially torn through. It has Hebrew writing on it. Would you kindly inspect it?" "There are 3 names in English, sir, also and a date, but I am sorry to say that I cannot read Hebrew writing." "Thank you. The names have the appearance of being signatures. They are John Rant, then Walter Gibson and James Frost. And the date is 20th of July, 1875. The coroner shook a puzzled head. This is not like any Hebrew I've ever learnt. Of course. It's not Hebrew at all. It is English. And it is a will. It did not take many minutes to show that here indeed was a will of Dr. John Rant, bequeathing the whole of the property lately held by John Eldred to Mrs. Mary Simpson. Clearly, the discovery of such a document would amply justify Mr. Eldred's agitation. As to the partial tearing of the leaf, the coroner pointed out that no useful purpose could be attained by speculations whose correctness it would never be possible to establish. The Tractate Middoth was naturally taken into charge by the coroner for further investigation, and Mr. Garrett explained privately to him the history of it and the position of events so far as he knew or guessed them. He returned to his work next day, and on his walk to the station passed the scene of Mr. Eldred's catastrophe. He could hardly leave it without another look, though the recollection of what he had seen there made him shiver, even on that bright morning. He walked round with some misgivings behind the felled tree. Something dark that lay there still made him start back for a moment, but it hardly stirred. Looking closer, he saw that it was a thick black mass of cobwebs, and as he stirred it gingerly with his stick, several large spiders ran out into the grass. There is no great difficulty in imagining the steps by which William Garrett, from being an assistant in a great library, attained to his present position, a prospective owner of Bretfield Manor, now in the occupation of his mother-in-law, Mrs. Mary Simpson.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Yeah.
Great reading again by you, and a very mysterious story.
Yeah.
And, you know, you really conjure up the atmosphere of the library and the train journey, and you know, the coroner's court. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for reading for us.
Well, it was fun, and thank you, you know, for facilitating all these adventures into ghostly literature. And it's been a great thing to do, and to reach out to just our amazing, regular, loyal, and enthusiastic audiences, but hopefully to some new audience as well on the airwaves, and perhaps even in this dark time, to lighten up an evening with a bit of good old-fashioned storytelling. And thank you all for everybody for listening in, supporting us. And to you, especially Peter, for your good offices. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd like to add my best wishes to everyone watching, and to say to you that you can follow Hexhamtv on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And this is one of a number of live events that will be taking place on Hexhamtv. So do look out for future events. And Stephen will be coming up again, no doubt, within those events. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Stephen. And
thank you.
have a good evening.